Hey there folks, the number one Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre record, Missionary. When a certain ex-NWA member went solo and released The Chronic in 1992, the hardcore lyrical style of gangster rap eventually managed to cement itself as the most mainstream and, surprisingly at the time, commercially viable form of rap. And while a number of projects that came out of the West Coast and even the East Coast throughout the rest of the decade could be compared to The Chronic in terms of sheer quality, it is a wholly singular record in terms of its impact and in regards to the influence that it had on the culture of the music industry. An essay could be written on the influence that Dr. Dre would have throughout the rest of the 90s based on The Chronic alone. But one of the most impressive qualities in terms of historical relevance in the history of rap is the fact that it introduced a fresh-faced and then mostly unknown Snoop Doggy Dogg, soon to just be known much more simply and famously as Snoop Dogg, and eventually briefly Snoop Lion, but we don't talk about that. Legacy aside, however, I don't think it's a huge secret or widely disagreed that Snoop and Dre's respective careers have kind of dried up a fair bit in recent years. I mean, Dr. Dre remains as elusive as ever, while Snoop is seemingly hell-bent on just absolutely tarnishing his legacy with bizarre crypto projects, the aforementioned failed rebranding as pop reggae artist Snoop Lion, and one middling solo record after the next. I mean, if it weren't for his consistent presence across various forms of media and the occasional beloved features see institutionalized off of Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, the Snoop D-O-double-G would be nothing more than a product of his time that managed to put out a couple of classic records before really falling off in a pretty major way. It's honestly been his work as a media personality that's kind of kept his career afloat. The guy really hasn't put anything of note in the music industry out in quite some time. In fact, one could argue maybe a good couple decades. Missionary is intended to be a sort of continuation of both Dre and Snoop, especially the latter's, glory days, the time where they were putting out records like 1993's Doggystyle, but the final result feels like tarnished heroes trying to do their best impressions of the artist that they used to be, while failing to connect with anything that allows them to feel re-energized in any particular way. It's a record that tries to come across as cool and in your face at points, yet at the same time it manages to be nothing more than just extremely limp and at times slightly embarrassing. It feels important to start off the meat of this review by saying there are actually a few moments on this record that kind of gave me hope that this was going to be an okay album. I mean, it would be unreasonable for anyone to expect a Snoop Dre collaborative project in 2024 to match the peak of their careers in terms of quality and commercial success. I don't think anyone was expecting this to be a smash hit in any particular way, commercially or critically, but there are some cuts on here that do have some genuinely solid moments, which is a lot more than I was ever expecting from this record going into it. I think that a song like Hard Knocks or Skyscrapers, for example, see Snoop deliver some pretty tight and surprisingly modern flows, which is nice to see considering the guy really, for the most part, refuses to change up his style and kind of sounds the exact same as he did in 1990-something, albeit significantly less energetic, on most of his recent projects. It's just nice to see him kind of switch things up and come across more like a gracefully aging rapper rather than just, well, an aging rapper. Unfortunately, those aforementioned positive qualities are kind of immediately thrown out the window by some extremely questionable and confusing creative directions that they end up going in certain points. The aforementioned Hard Knocks is a prime example of that, and especially frustrating as it's a potentially decent track that's besmirched by tired and repetitive references to gin and juice, something that he's been on for decades at this point, and something that's gotten extremely stale, more on that later, as well as this corny choir style chorus. It's these excessive nods to their older superior material though that really do bother me, and it's not uncommon here whatsoever. I mean, their directionless attempt at what one can only imagine was intended to be a club anthem, the song Thank You, immediately structures its entire persona around the commercial peak of both artists involved, with the opening lines coming straight from Dr. Dre's The Watcher, a song that originally didn't even feature a proper guest verse from Snoop. So why is he the one referencing that here? It doesn't even make any sense in that regard. And most of the blame for this can kind of be pinned on Snoop himself, the sort of nostalgia bait that goes on a lot here. I mean, when he first came onto most people's radar in the early to mid 1990s, he established his artistic persona as immediately as possible, and it allowed him to become such a distinct voice and MC for the time period, but he's also done so little to change its sense that most of Missionary is still the same braggadocio, sex talk, and drug discussion that Snoop has brought to the table since day one, and while those are obviously not inherently bad themes for any piece of art, it becomes tiring when a man has been doing exactly that and nothing but that nearly for 30 years at this point, and it becomes harder and harder every year to take anything that he says seriously. Obviously, it goes without saying that everything that has ever been said in his career, like many other artists across all genres, is largely embellished, I'm sure, but man, the murder and gunshots that take place at the beginning of the song Fire, for example, I can't take them even remotely seriously when they are immediately followed by the words of a man who is now a judge on NBC's The Voice. I like The Voice. I watch it with my family. I like Reba McEntire and Gwen Stefani. They're funny, and it's a decent show. That being said, I cannot take you seriously as a hardcore, tough individual if you're in the big red chair that does the swivel spin whenever they want to pick someone during the blind auditions. It does not work. He can't sell it at all, and that's fine and expected this far into his career, but the fact that he's still trying to pull it off, it just doesn't work at all. And again, it isn't even inherently a bad thing that Snoop can't pull off these particular lyrical themes as well as he once did when it was 1995. That's totally fine. In fact, one would expect that as an individual aged, it would be harder to pull these songwriting styles off and actually come across as genuine and earnest. But the issue is that Snoop has never really tried to evolve in any way. And now, 30-some years later, since the proper debut of Snoop and the solo debut of Dre, almost 30 years exact, actually, 32, I should say, it just kind of comes across like sort of your dad telling you how badass he was when he was your age. It's cringeworthy, somewhat amusing, but generally speaking, there's just isn't much of substance here. Dre is not totally innocent here either, and it goes without saying that it's been quite some time since his most acclaimed projects came out, over 30 years ago, in fact. And now, at this point, much of his modern legacy is records like his 2015 comeback, big quotations around comeback album Compton, a record that received lukewarm reception at best and largely faced criticism because of Dre's lackluster and personality-lacking production, and things haven't changed nearly a decade later. This is a record that has beats with zero flavor and feel like the bare minimum that one would expect from someone like Dr. Dre, a absolute legend of his respective field behind the scenes as a producer. And some of the songs here lean towards these unmemorable pop rap cuts that feel ready to hit the radio for like a week or two before fading into obscurity, while others come across as these vain attempts to create these carefree and lush yet still punchy types of 90s West Coast rap beats that Dre would have done beautifully several decades ago. But in 2024, it just does not work as well as it once did, and does not manage to even remotely achieve the same vibe that he was able to many, many years ago. And in either situation, nothing here feels like anything more than Dr. Dre attempting to see what sticks and what doesn't, and unfortunately, just about every track on Missionary falls into the latter category. There's really no sonic direction here. It's just Dre doing what he normally does, smashing all of those different sounds together, and all of them feeling a bit lazy in their own respective ways. Perhaps the most annoying part about the production job on display here, though, is the excessive usage of painfully obvious samples and interpolations of various songs that were definitely picked and chosen exclusively because the listener probably already knows them, and if you hear any given song on this record, there's like a 45% chance you'll hear a melody that'll make you go, oh, hey, I know that song. I mean, whether you look at Sticky Situation, which makes use of the iconic Suzanne Vega's Tom's Diner chorus intro kind of the do-do-do-do's, you know what I'm talking about, or its relentlessly lazy usage of songs from acts like Sly and the Family Stone or Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, the latter of which, Last Dance with Mary Jane, features an awful Jelly Roll feature that butchers one of Petty's more ambitious hit songs. Everything here just feels wildly uninspired, and one would hope that Missionary would be the album that Dre used as a means to really deliver some of his most creative and boundary-pushing work in recent years. I mean, this album is intended, after all, to be a continuation of what is almost universally agreed upon to be both Dre and Snoop's golden era, so to speak. But at the very least, it doesn't seem unreasonable that this record should have maybe been a bit more than a bunch of half-baked samples of songs almost exclusively added in here to remind the listener of songs they might genuinely enjoy when they realize that this album is awful in and of itself. I mean, there is no other reason to get Sting on here with an awful take on the Police's Message in a Bottle on Another Part of Me than to just desperately cling to a classic song and hope that this new batch of tracks might manage to leech off of the aforementioned song's cultural relevance in any sort of way. It nearly feels embarrassing how uninspired Missionary's creative vision is, especially when one considers the artistic legacies that this record is not only a part of, but supposedly meant to add to during its peak eras. I just don't understand why this album sounds like nothing more than something that was just completely thrown together, especially when it was as hyped up as it was. In simple terms, Missionary is a failed comeback for the long-ago, once-flawless duo of Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre, but on a deeper level, I kind of feel like this is an examination of what happens when two otherwise talented artists attempt to recreate their golden years of their output without actually doing anything to ensure that it stands out from that work or, in fact, anything else within their own respective genre in the modern day. I mean, Missionary could have easily been an album that saw Snoop and Dre delivering some solid verses, some fine beats, before calmly fading into obscurity. In fact, going into this record, that's pretty much what I expected. I think that anyone expecting a brilliant album from either of the artists in question at this point in their respective histories is maybe a little bit delusional, but at the same time, it just feels like this is a major disappointment in every way that it possibly conceivably could have been. This just feels like a sloppy retread of themes and ideas and sounds that they pulled off much better as 20-somethings than they do now as 50-somethings. And while I don't want to be ageist or anything like that in regards to either of the artists involved here, it does feel a bit corny and a bit disingenuous, to say the least, when they're trying to pull off the same exact sounds that they've been at for multiple decades at this point without really having anything new to add to it. It really does feel like they recognize that artistically they peaked decades ago and are just trying to recapture that magic and failing to do so the entire time. I mean, on one hand, I nearly think it's admirable that the duo can return to their stylistic roots of breezy yet punchy beats and lyrics focusing on excess of all kinds, but it just feels like a complete and utter shame that they don't have anything new to add to those ideas to make this come across like a respectable listening experience and more than just nostalgia bait for two artists that seem to be just as desperate for that nostalgia as a lot of their fan base is at this point. And at the end of the day, that's all Missionary really feels like it is. Missionary is awkward, it's unmemorable, it lacks any of the charisma that sold Snoop and Dre as partners in crime in the first place. It has been 31 years since Doggystyle initially dropped all the way back in 1993, and it just feels like it's way too late to switch positions now. This is a late career flop and also a late year worst albums contender for 2024. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. With that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching the Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.